In this lecture, we'll talk about case, numbers, arrays, ranges, and file I/O. So Ruby supports two flavors of case expressions. Number one is where you have a case expression, which is basically just similar to a series of if statements. And the second one, more commonly used, is where you specify a target next to a case, and then each subsequent when clause is compared to that target. And you can even use regular expressions in this second flavor. Important thing to note is that there is no fall-through logic in Ruby's case expressions. So if you're used to having to use breaks in your case expressions, let's say from Java or from JavaScript, you don't have to do it in Ruby. So just to give an example, the first flavor of a case is when you have a variable, let's say name, compared to Joe or something completely unrelated. So you have if time is greater than 23 or else clause. So these are not related at all. Whereas the second flavor, you specify a variable that you're trying to case against right next to the case, and then your when clauses become very efficient in that you don't have to specify what you're trying to match against because it knows, because you specified that in the case. And you could say when this regular expression matches the target, then do something. So in this case, you print something. Numbers. Numbers in Ruby are full-fledged objects. They're not primitives. So if you're used to Java where numbers are primitives, that's not the case. They have many methods, and even simple operations are really calling methods in disguise, as we're going to see, because, as I mentioned, Ruby is object-possessed. So you could have a variable A is 23, B is 0. You have a method it's called a predicate method. 0 is B 0? Yeah, it is. Is A even? No, that's not even. And there's obviously also a method for odd. You also could say 1 up to 3 times print something. So in this case, up to is a method on 1. It takes a parameter 3, and it also takes a block that has you do something. So in this case, it prints out hello there 3 times. You could also do to the power of by doing 2 multiplication, 2 stars. So A, in this case 23 to the power of 10 gives you this number. And this is interesting. So this is interpolation of A plus B in a string. And it's the same thing as calling the plus method and passing in the B parameter. So A plus B is really syntactic sugar for calling the plus method on the A variable. You also could have a method called between. So you could check if A is between, let's say, 20 and 30. These are just 2 parameters that you're passing into a between method, and the answer is true. Speaking of ranges, you could have a data type in Ruby that's a range. And it's basically expressed with either 2 dots or 3 dots. And it doesn't just have to be numbers. It could also be, let's say, letters. So 1 through 20 or A through Z. Now, if you have 2 dots, that means all inclusive. So 1 is included in the range and 20 is included in the range. But 3 dots means that it's end exclusive, which means Z in this case is not included. So A is included, B, C, D, and so on, up through Z, but not including Z. And it's very efficient because even though you're specifying a big range, you only have to keep track of the beginning and the end. So in terms of your memory, if this would be an array, it would take up a lot of space, but because it's a range, it's very efficient, doesn't take up much space. Now, if you want to convert a range to an array, you could do that. You would just call the to_a method on the range, and that would automatically create an array for you with all the numbers or all the letters in that range as part of that array. And you could also use it for conditions and intervals, as we're going to see in a minute. So for example, you could create a range called some range, the value 1 through 3, and it knows that the max in that range is a 3, and that range includes number 2. You could also use a triple equals, and this is kind of a funky operator in Ruby, triple equals. A range 1 through 10 includes 5.3 in it. Now, this is not ambidextrous, so if you would say 5.3 triple equals a range 1 through 10, that would not be true, because 5.3 number has no triple equals that lets you know if you are inside a range or not. But if you start with a range 1 through 10, triple equals, that does include 5.3. A range of A through R with 3 dots does not include R, because 3 dots is AND exclusive. And you could also use ranges in your conditions. So for example, in that case, the second flavor that I mentioned of age, you could compare the range, are you in the range of 0 through 12? Again, because the second flavor happens to use the triple equals in the whens. So 0 through 12, and then 13 through 19, and then anything else, you could just say something else. Okay, arrays. Arrays is a very important API in Ruby, and it's basically a collection of objects. So, and it's auto-expandable. So if you used to, for example, Java, where you have an array, and you have an array list, and you have a list interface, in Ruby it's just an array. And you have an array, and the array auto-expands for you. You index it similar to Java arrays with this operator, which is really just a method. And then you could index with either with negative numbers or ranges, which are kind of interesting examples. And then array also lets you have not just homogeneous types, but also heterogeneous types in the same array. It's just a way to have stuff in it. So if you want to put in an integer, a word, or something else in there, that's fine. You could also use this syntax for string array. So in this case, instead of saying quote, quote around the 1, comma, quote, quote around the 2, you could just say %W, and then in the curlies, you could say 1, 2, 3, and so on. And that will create a string array for you that has elements 1 and 2, and so on. So let's see an example. As I mentioned, you could have an array, and this is how you create an array, with a number, a word, and a symbol. And you could then index that by referencing it. So in this case, you are indexing and getting this variable, 2. And you could multiply strings in Ruby. So what would happen if you multiply a string? Well, if you take one string and you multiply it by 2, you would get 2 string right here. So if you want to have an array of words, you could do pretty cool stuff going on here, no quotes, and you could index it by doing -2, which would give you the word on, because that's 1, 2, that's the second from the end. So when you have a minus, that means start from the end and then do 2 back. Now, array also has methods like first and last. So this is the first, and then this is the last, pretty, and here. And let's say you want to grab 2 words from an array starting from 3 words back. So that would be 1, 2, 3. You go 3 back, and then you do going on, you grab in these 2 words. Or you want to grab a range out of an array. I want to grab the second, through including the fourth element of an array, stuff going on, because it's zero index, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, or you want to grab 1 through 3, not including 3, you could do that as well. And let's say you want to make a string out of arrays that are joined by a semicolon. That's just a method away. You do join, and then you have a string that's pretty cool stuff going on here, separated by a semicolon. Now, how do you modify an array? Well, you could push to an array, either with a method push or with this symbol right here, two of these symbols. And then to remove, you could remove a pop or a shift. And we'll see what the difference is in a minute. If you want to set an array, you just use the two brackets right here. If you want to sort or reverse, you could use sort or reverse. And if it does not have the exclamation, it doesn't actually modify the array, it creates a new array. But if it has a bang, it actually modifies the contents of an array. And this is actually pretty useful. You could randomly pull out an element or a few elements out of an array with a sample method. So let's see some examples. So whereas in Java, for example, you would have its own data type, its own data structure called stack, in Ruby you just have methods that support a stack, and you just use a regular array as a stack. So for example, you do stack, and then you push an element onto the stack, or you use the push method, doesn't really matter. And then if you pop the stack, that pops the word 2, which is the second one that made it onto the stack. Now, if you want to use a queue type of a data structure, then you would do queue push 1 and 2, and then you do shift instead of pop, and shift actually shifts out the the 0 for the first element of a queue and not the second one. And you could do sort to sort the array in order, and then you could reverse that sort. And if you use a bang, that actually modifies the array. And you could set a specific element in the array. So in this case, you're doing, even though the array only has 0, 1, 2, 3 elements, you could say, hey, can you set the 6th element of an array to 33? And that will fill in for you with 2 nils in the positions that it's lacking. So it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is missing, and 6 you want to be 33. So it automatically will fill in nil for the missing position. So it's pretty intuitive. Some useful array methods we're going to take a look at are each, select, reject, map, and inject. And there are many, many others. I strongly recommend that you get very familiar with an array API. So far we saw that string is a very important API, and arrays are also very important APIs in Ruby. So you should spend some time going through that documentation of arrays and seeing how they're used. So some examples of the methods that I mentioned, you could basically loop through each element of an array, and this will be very familiar to people familiar with functional programming. So you could say, for each element in the array, do something in the block. So it takes a parameter, the block parameter here, num, and you print in each number. And print doesn't print a new line, so basically you just have 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, and 10 all smushed together. Now this is a very interesting use case. So you could select elements out of an array. So this basically says, I have an array 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, and I'm passed a number parameter into a block, and I want to select all the elements that match this condition. So the condition is, in this case, happens to be a range of 4 through 8, where the range triple equals that number. So that will be 4, 7, and 8. And then you could also select, and then you could chain another method. So in this case, you could do reject. So reject is the opposite of select, and basically it's saying reject anything that's even. So when number is even, reject that, and that will give you 7. So you're starting out with a full array, you're selecting 4 through 8 range, and then you're rejecting out of that range anything that's even. Okay? So another use case you could do is you want to modify each element in the array and return an array with new elements in it. In this case, it's a map without an exclamation, so it doesn't actually modify the existing array, the A array. And again, this would be very familiar to people doing functional programming, let's say in JavaScript or ES6. And basically you have 1, 3, 4, 7, 8, 10, and you say for each one of those elements, multiply by 3. So you get a new array that's 3, 9, 12, 21, 24, and 30. There's also an inject. This one is a little bit harder to understand, but basically what it does is instead of just one element, one parameter in your block, it has 2 parameters, and the first one is sort of an accumulator of other things. So for example, let's say you want to sum all the elements in the array. So far we'll have the sum so far. So if you don't pass anything in there as a parameter, it will start with the first element. So in this case, the first element is 1, or the 0th element is 1. So it will be 1 plus 3, and then plus 4, plus 7, plus 8, plus 10. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a sum of all elements. Or you could have an inject with a 1, and this is basically your initial value. Your initial value is 1, and then inside your block, you're going to have 1 times, in this case, happens to be 1, 3, 4, 7. So you are multiplying by the next element. Now, this is basically the same thing as the first one, where you're not specifying a block, but you are saying use the plus method. That's what the symbol plus specifies a method. So take an array and then use the plus method to add up all the elements inside that array. Somewhat unrelated topic, file I/O. So the way you read and write files in Ruby is you have to open a file, and then you specify permissions. In this case, it's reading and writing, W+, and you pass the file argument to a block. Remember, I mentioned that the block, you could have curlies or you could have do end for your block. And the reason why you would do it this way is because in this case, you don't have to worry about closing the file. Ruby knows, the open method knows that whatever happens in the block, when the block is finished, the open method is going to close the file. So in this case, you're modifying a file. So the file is your test.txt, and you keep writing to a file. So hello there, no really. So it actually keeps writing new lines to a file. If you want to read lines from a file, so it's the same thing. You specify this for reading, and the file, you could say each line. For each line in the file, have a block where the line becomes your block parameter, and then keep adding lines to the line array array. And what this chump method does is it actually gets rid of a new line character at the end of the line. So get rid of a new line character at the end of the line, and then add that line to the line array. That's what this does. And as we see here, the line array is two strings, hello there and no really. Now, another thing you could do is somewhat different from these two approaches. You could just use the IO class, and you could read the file test.txt, and you could split everything in that input using one or more spaces, and that will give you all the words in as an array in that file.